Hello, thanks very much for coming along. So I'm going to talk today about Atomic Habits, which is a book by James Clear, and he's an American bloke. And the book, unsurprisingly, is about habits, making them and keeping them, and all that sort of stuff. So we start off really by talking about incremental gains, and this is something Charlie certainly mentioned in some of the talks that I've been to that he's done in the past. One of the well-known ones is Dave Brailsford and the England cycling or British cycling team, the Tour de France team, and all that sort of stuff. But what I really quite like, because rugby is more my game than cycling, is that of Clive Woodward and what he did with the England rugby team prior to the 2003 World Cup. So what you can see here is a chap called Johnny Wilkinson, for any of you youngsters out there who don't remember who this is. And you see Johnny Wilkinson at the very beginning of his career and then slightly later on in his career. So the picture on the left-hand side shows the old Johnny in his old England rugby shirt. Notably, it's long-sleeved and quite baggy. And what Clive Woodward noticed was, if we make some little gains, we'll be a better team overall. And so a couple of those little gains that he made was, I'll tell you what, our shirts are quite easy to grab hold of when they're tackling. So if I can just make them a little bit less easy to grab hold of, then that's a little incremental gain, and that'll make us a little bit better. So one of the things that he did was he got rid of the sleeves and made them short sleeved, and he made them very, very tight fitting, which is what you see on the right. The problem with that, of course, is that now wearing an England rugby shirt socially looks absolutely god awful on all middle-aged men who like to wear them, myself included, which is a bit of a shame, but there we go. So the point of this is that habits are the compound effect of self-improvement. So it's all these little incremental gains that we can make that over the longer term will build themselves into habits. So it's a slow burn. It's not something that happens in a hurry. And there was a lovely quote that's held over the San Antonio Spurs locker room around about patience and this, which is, when nothing seems to help, I go and look at the stonecutter hammering away at his rock, perhaps 100 times without as much as a crack showing in it. Yet at the 101st blow, it will split into two. And I know it was not the last blow that did it, but all that had gone before it. So when we're talking about atomic habits, sadly, we're not talking about great, big, massive atomic explosions, which I must confess is what I hoped when I picked the book up, but rather it's a little bit more subtle than that. It's the building blocks, the atoms that sit within it, that are going to provide you with remarkable results in keeping your habits and getting rid of the bad ones too. So let's have a look. How do we build habits? So we start off with something called the habit loop, right? So this is the mental process that you go through that creates a habit. So you start with a cue, and I'll give you some examples of this in a second. So you start with a cue, and that cue will then create some form of a craving, something, you want something out of it. And because you then want something, you naturally respond to that want to change something, and then you're rewarded with it at a later date or after you've made that response. So an example of this might be, and you might not think of this as a habit, right? So I walk into a dark room. Okay, the cue is that the room is dark. And my craving is that I'd really be able to see in this room. And so my response is that I turn around and I flick on the lights. And in doing so, I am rewarded with a beautifully illuminated bedroom, showing all my dirty clothes all over the bedroom floor, which is less of a reward. And perhaps that's another habit that we can look at. Another option, another example might be, my mouth feels dirty. That's your cue. Your craving is, I want a clean mouth and I want it to taste nice. So your response is, you put a piece of chewing gum in, and the reward is that your mouth then tastes nice and clean and minty. Okay. So ultimately, our behavior is driven by our desires just to solve these problems. And we create habits to take us through that and just to take us through it quickly without having to think the whole time. We don't want to always go into a room and go, oh, it's a room. Now, how am I going to make this room light again? If the habit is just the sort of the underlying psychological way of cracking through it subconsciously. So when we're trying to set new habits, we can look at these. We're going to go through all these. We'll look at each of these habit cues in turn. But ultimately, what we're trying to do, certainly, we're trying to set good habits. We can look at trying to make it obvious. Make that cue obvious. How do we go about doing that? When there's a craving, we want to make it attractive. Of course we do, because that's why we crave it. So how do we make it more attractive? To respond to it, we need to make it easy. And when the reward is there, we need to make it satisfying. So let's go back to the dark room thing again, right? It's all going to sound a little bit simple, this, but we go into a dark room, right? It's obvious that it's dark for us, yeah? The craving that we want it to be light, yeah, of course that's there. It's a bit hard to demonstrate how we're going to make that more attractive. The response to making it easy is you have a light switch at sort of hand height rather than down on the floor, and the satisfaction of seeing a nice well lit room, you'd say you put a nice light bulb in there or something like that. It's not just good habits, though, of course. Some of us have got bad habits, whether that be picking our nose, eating junk food, or spending too much time on our phones, or any other, multitude of bad habits that we have. And so we need to try to break some of these habits. We might want to break some of these habits. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we make the cue invisible. Yeah. So we try and disguise the fact that we try and disguise that subliminal message getting through so we don't start doing it. We make it unattractive so that we don't really want to continue with the habit. The response is harder to do, and the reward will be unsatisfying. So we'll have a look at these, and we'll dress them up with some examples just to bring it to life a little bit, if you like. So this is me getting very excited on PowerPoint. Some moving slides. So there we go. The first one we're going to start with is how do we make something obvious? So this is a Japanese train conductor, fairly obviously. Now the point with this is, when you go on a train in Japan, it seems that all the conductors have got ticks. They point at clocks to say, this is the time the train's leaving. It's 12:37, and off the train goes. The drivers there point at the speedo in the tray to say, this is the speed that we're going at. They'll look at the platform and say, all of the people are off the train. The point and the reason behind doing this is that it was demonstrated that by actually doing, making a conscious effort to point something out, to do it, to say it out loud, reduced the mistakes and the errors within the train system. And they showed in the Japanese system by 85%. I think in Germany they showed siding errors. So just parking the train in the wrong siding was reduced by something like 35%, just by saying, I am now going into the siding on the right-hand side, although presumably they said it in German. Indeed, when I leave the house, I have something similar that I do myself. Okay, so I will leave the house and I say spectacles, testicles, wallet, and watch, which is just my way of going, right, have I got everything? My wallet, my phone. Okay, right, we're good to go. Car, keys, and all that sort of stuff. Now, the point and the purpose behind this is that if we're going to change our habits, you need to be totally aware of what your current habits are. Okay, so we need to think this through, because this is the very first stage. You're going to say, right, well, this is a good habit and this is a bad habit. So this might be your morning, So you woke up, you got out of bed, and then you dragged the comb across your head. You found your way downstairs and had a smoke, and then somebody spoke, and you fell into a dream. You started to meditate. That's obviously this is a Beatles song that I've taken this example from. But it just demonstrates that at each of these times, you've probably got this habit. So you wake up, sure, and you get out of bed. For me, I would probably then wander to the shower actually and have a shower and what have you. Now, the first thing to do, if we're going to follow the guidance within this book, is to analyze all these habits and to be totally open and honest about them. So, yeah, so this is exactly what I do. I do wake up, I do go downstairs, and then I go out and have a cigarette before my morning meditation ritual, for example. Now, once you've built that map of the habits that you have, you can then start to go through and analyze them and say, actually, some of these are good habits, some of these are bad habits, and some of these are fairly indifferent habits. Yeah. So waking up, I would say, well, waking up is probably it just happens. I mean, I would say that's a fairly indifferent habit, although not waking up would be a bad habit, or it would be dead. Getting out of bed, likewise, is probably a good habit. Otherwise, you'd be lounging around in bed all day. And cleaning your hair or brushing your hair is probably a good thing to do. Having a smoke, you'd probably argue that's probably quite a bad habit. But doing some morning meditation, again, that seems like a pretty decent habit. So when we've built all this, we can now start to work on this. And so one of the first sort of bits of advice that we might have is that you see, well, we've got these habits, but I want to build a new decent habit, right? So one of these things that we're going to say is, I don't drink enough water through the day, and so how am I going to start to build one of these habits in that gets me to drink some more water? So if we look at this here, I might say, well, I go downstairs and I have a smoke, but actually what's happening while I'm having that smoke is that I've got the kettle boiling. Well, this is a daily habit. I put the kettle on every morning. And to get the kettle to boil, I have to fill the kettle with water. So why don't I create a habit at that point, stack a habit into my already habitful day of I'll fill the kettle with water, but at the same time, I'm going to fill a glass with water so that I have a pint of water, and then we put the kettle on to boil and away we go. And then you can stack something onto that habit. So you might say, well, I don't eat enough fruit. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have my pint of water, and then I'll go and have a banana or something like that. So we're perpetually looking at what habits we're doing and then stacking new habits onto them, just because it becomes really easy and straightforward then to make your habits work for you. And that is, you see examples of making habits easy in things like putting a bowl of fruit out on the side is going to encourage you to eat more fruit than hiding your fruit in the bottom of the fridge. And the well-known trick in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam was that they painted a little fly on the urinal to encourage you to wee on the fly rather than weeing all over the bowl. And again, it's just these little quirks that just help with your help with designing your habits. And how do we break this bad habit? We want to make these things invisible. There we go, very good slide there. Now, so how do we make it invisible? Back in the 1970s, there was a big war that happened in Vietnam. The Americans got involved in it, and it was all pretty terrible. Over in Vietnam, there's quite a lot of drugs. One of those drugs in particular is heroin. And of all the soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War, 15% of them were heroin addicts. Over 35% of soldiers in the Vietnam War had tried heroin. And that's you've got to say probably not great for your fighting GI. They were taking soldiers off the front line and treating them, but then pretty much as soon as they went back to the front line, they became addicted to heroin again. What was notable, however, was that if they treated them and took them off the front line and then they sent them back to America, that very, very few became addicted again. In fact, actually, I think the stats were that of those, all those addicts, that only 5% of them became addicts again once they returned to the United States. The point being that it was just the change in the environment that they found themselves in that changed their ultimate response to their habit. And of course, you see, we talk about this, one talks about this when you see drug addicts being taken off the street, put in prison. Of course, they clean up their habits, but as soon as they're back out of prison and back into exactly the same place that they were before, they become addicts again. And this is no surprise because ultimately their environment hasn't really changed. In order to treat that addict properly, we probably need to, whether or not they need to go to prison, but they need to come out and then be put in a different situation. And that's hard, finding new friends or what have you. So to remove a habit, the first thing to do is just to try to spend less time in those tempting situations. So that might be I spend too much time on my phone. So leave your phone in a different room, you know? If you read your phone before you go to bed, don't bring your phone to bed with you. I mean, it seems a bit obvious when you put it that way. If you spend too much time playing, whatever it is on the Xbox, whatever, I can't remember any names on the Xbox. But if you spend too much time on the Xbox, put your console away at the end of your gaming session, and then it won't be quite so tempting to pull it all back out and put it together again when you want to have another street fight. Is Street Fight still a go? I can't remember. Anyway, there we are. So moving on, how do we make these habits attractive? What do we do to do that? Right? There we go. That was a sound effect there. So here we go. So we're going to have a look at some dopamine now, right? So another little story about more drugs, I'm afraid, but dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, therefore found in your head, in your brain. And back in the 1950s, some scientists started to understand a little bit more about the presence actually of neurotransmitters and what they did to your body. And so they started to do some experiments on mice. Mice are always the best things to do experiments on. And one of these experiments was that they started to put a dopamine antagonist, or a blocker of dopamine, into these mice to see how the mice reacted. Okay. And the mice didn't react particularly well to having their dopamine blocked. They just became pretty bloody morose. Okay. So much so that most of the mice, they didn't want to do anything, They were there, they'd walk around, but they just weren't happy about it. So much so that they just totally lost interest in life, and that they then died just because they didn't bother to drink any water. That's how uninterested in life the poor mice became, because their dopamine had been cut. And then they did the opposite experiment, right? So they then had a little mouse, and every time it poked its nose in a box, it got a little dopamine hit. And it didn't take very long. It was like a couple of hours of this happening, at which point the mouse would go back to revisit this box 800 times an hour, like say 10 times a minute. Just keeps going back, bang, straight back into the box, and away you go. And we humans, we have these dopamine hits, yeah. So if you're a gambler, you get a dopamine hit. Interesting, you don't get the dopamine hit when you win the money and all that sort of stuff. The dopamine hit comes just before you place the money. So it's the anticipation of what's going to happen rather than the actual act of doing it. Similarly, cocaine addicts, they get their dopamine hit just before they snort the line of cocaine. So it's not the cocaine that's giving them the high. The cocaine is giving them a high, obviously, but it's the dopamine that makes them want to come back. It's this whole anticipation of the high that's going to come. So how do you work this into setting your habits? So one idea is the idea of temptation bundling. Yeah. So if there's a habit that you struggle with, but something that you really enjoy, how can we build those two together, right? So it might be that one particular habit of yours that's possibly not great is binging on Netflix, right? And one habit that you just really can't get to is cycling on the turbo, because I know Charlie likes to cycle on a turbo, but cycling on the turbo, right? Well, you can bundle these two together, yeah? So why not cycle on your turbo whilst watching your Netflix binges, right? Because it's because in doing so, you're excited about the Netflix, so this is cool, but you're also building in the right habit of doing your cycling. And of course, over time, because you keep getting the dopamine hit at the same time that you're getting on the bike as you are turning on the Netflix, over time, you're beginning to reframe this, right? So now all of a sudden getting on the bike isn't about getting on the bike and doing exercise, isn't that boring? All of a sudden it becomes a good thing. It becomes more exciting that we're getting on the bike. Because also you're going to get the Netflix hit. So it's trying to bundle good stuff with bad stuff together to try and make the stuff you're less keen on doing seem more palatable and more enjoyable. Another from a business perspective, perhaps, if there's perhaps we need to call some people and we can't really be bothered to call the people. If we do this every day, one way to stack that might be if you really like, if every lunchtime you go and read the news and you enjoy looking through the sports headlines or whatever, yeah. So you're going to have your lunch, make the 3 calls, and then do the BBC website surfing directly afterwards. Because again, you're linking the stuff that I've got to do, but I haven't really got a great habit around it, with the stuff that I'm probably going to do and really enjoy doing afterwards. And then how do we break these habits and make them unattractive? At this point, it becomes all about the mind. Okay, so we need to start to reframe your mindset. I was sort of insinuating a little bit of this in the previous slide. So your habits aren't necessarily the best way to do something. And as I said right at the beginning, it's just a subconscious way of filtering and making life easy for yourself. Yeah. So for example, there might not be the best way to do it. Smoking, for example, is a habit that some people have. And that might be their way of dealing with stress. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to deal with stress, but for that person, that's the habit that they've created to deal with that issue. For another person, dealing with stress might be to go for a run. And so there's 2 different ways of tackling the same fundamental issue, which is I'm feeling a bit stressed. And so at this stage, when we say it's all in the mind, it's how do you reframe these issues to get yourself the better habit? So, for example, you might not want to do exercise because exercise is boring and it hurts and what have you. But if you can reframe your mind into saying, I'm not going out for a long run just to get fitter, but I'm just going out. I'm going to go and build some endurance now, and I'm going to get really fast. Yeah, you're putting a bit more of an optimistic spin on this whole idea of going out and doing some exercise, and that will help you frame this in your mind that this is a great thing to do and it's not a chore. Similarly, saving money. It's often associated with sacrifice. Oh, I've got to save this money. I'm not going to have any money left this month, and what have you. But if you can associate it perhaps with freedom, if you can associate it with, then I'll get a bigger, better holiday at the end of the year, or I'll be able to retire sooner, or I will have, more financial freedom at a later date. It's just a nicer way of trying to reframe this idea of saving in your own mind. And another interesting one for those who get nervous about public speaking, for example, is and quite, you get anxious, uptight, and all that sort of stuff. But again, if you can reframe that and say, "Oh, I'm not anxious and uptight. Actually, I'm excited about delivering this talk to people, and it's so great that I'm going to be able to share my opinions with other people from that forum." that it just puts it in a different perspective, that makes it that much easier to frame in your mind, and therefore easy to build the habit around. Now we're going to try and make these habits easy to do. This is the light switch at hand type. So repetition is massively important to building of habits, and I know this, you know, if we're trying to you know, I don't know, start off by doing some push-ups, for example. I've got to start doing push-ups. The hardest thing you can ever do is say, right, I'm going to do 100 push-ups, and just go down and do 100 push-ups and do 100 push-ups every day from a standing start. Instead, what's probably better is to say, I'm going to do a push-up, and you get down and you do a push-up, and you do that push-up every day. Because in just doing the one push-up, you're building the habit of doing push-ups, but you're not building the habit of putting yourself in a really uncomfortable and awkward position of forcing 100 push-ups out of the way. Yeah. So it's that, let's just do a little, but do it every day. And by doing this, then it builds the habit in you. So James Clear, the author, suggests that there is a 2-minute rule to any new habit that you start. And that is, any new habit shouldn't take any more than 2 minutes. Okay. And even to some quite bizarre degrees, right? So there's an example of a chap who was overweight, and wanted to start going to the gym. But he's got a 2-minute rule, right? So his rule was, right, he goes to the gym, he stays there for 2 minutes, and then he leaves again. But he does that 3 times a week. Goes to the gym, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, leaves again. Because over time, in developing the habit of going to the gym, the bloke went, well, I'm in the gym now, so you know what? I might as well do some exercise. And there he did. So he went in, and then, you know, whatever it was, I don't know, the first month, then he started doing 5 minutes on a treadmill. Thanks very much. I've done 5 minutes on a treadmill. I'm building the habit, and then he disappears. But it's just by repeating and repeating and repeating, getting into the habit of doing the habit, that will help you stick to keeping the habit. And you know, I mean, you don't necessarily need to go to the gym, perhaps, but you know, it could just be that it's just a case of stepping out of your front door is building the habit of going for a walk every day. Even if you don't go for the whole walk, but you stepped outside the front door, the habit is being developed that actually this is what you're going to end up doing. Similarly, I mean, I think Charlie Erdno writes a journal, and journals are meant to be really, really good in bringing together your thoughts, but equally it could be considered to be quite hard work. So the picture here is of a chap called Ernest Hemingway, who is a Nobel-winning author, and bon vivant and whiskey, not whiskey, or rum enthusiast. I think he went around most of the bars of Cuba drinking their rum, hundreds of them, called the Hemingway bar. Anyway, what he said, the best way is always to stop whilst the going remains good. Yeah. So even when he was writing all his books, he'd carry on writing whilst he was doing it really, whilst he was still enjoying it. Because as soon as it tails off, then actually, or as soon as it becomes less fun, then actually you leave that habit with, oh, that's not much fun, is it? I don't really like doing that. So go back to the journal. If you're writing your journal every day, do it for 2 minutes and do it, but stop whilst it's still fun and before it becomes, you know, laborious. Because as soon as it's laborious, you're going to be less enthusiastic about going back to it again tomorrow. And the other thing is remove friction. Yeah. So make your environment as easy as possible to continue to do these habits, right? So one example might be you don't read enough, right? So how do we make it easier for you to read more? So one example might be when you make your bed in the morning. I was about to say at night. When you make your bed in the morning, put a book on your pillow. So when you go to bed that night, you've already got a book there ready to read. makes it easy. If you want to do more drawing and stuff like that, leave pen and papers around the house so you can just pick it up and you can do something. I alluded to earlier, if you want to eat more fruit, leave the fruit bowl out. Don't hide it all away. Um, and we can do this the other way, of course, slightly as well. So if you spend too much time on your phone, make it a bit harder. Tidy your phone away. Don't carry it with you. If you watch too much telly, just unplug your telly when you finish watching it, because then actually the slightly laborious task of plugging your TV in at a later date might just stop you doing it. And one thing that James Clear suggested to me is if you drink too much beer, hide the beer in your fridge. Um, which ultimately seems a ridiculous idea. Where else would you keep this beer? But I think he was saying at the back of the fridge so you can't see it. But my beer takes over the whole of the bottom shelf of the fridge, so I don't know what I'm going to hide it behind. And then how do we make these habits? How do we break these bad habits by making them difficult? And of course, that there's beer in the back of the fridge and all that sort of stuff is of course making it difficult. There was a chap, another author. You never knew I was so literary, but there's another author, the chap called Victor Hugo, who wrote several very well-known novels. And he was making some money. So back in 1830, he was spending his time partying his way around gay Paris. I suspect, enjoying himself and the ladies a little bit. But his publisher was getting a little bit tired of Victor because the publisher had asked him to write a book, and Victor wasn't writing it. And they kept saying, wait, go on, we need to have this book now. No, and Victor was like, no, I've been partying, I've been on the absinthe again, mate. So they set him a deadline. They said, right, by the end of March 1831, you need to have written this book. But Victor, being an unusual man, recognized that unless he changed something, his lifestyle was going to continue, and this book wasn't going to get written. And so the change he made was he got his assistant to take all his clothes and leave him with just a shawl to sort of, cover his modesty. But it meant that they couldn't go out. So he couldn't carry on this partying lifestyle. And indeed, he just had to knuckle down and write the book. And he did. He wrote his bestseller, which was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And actually, rather than it being published on the 31st of January, he got it in 2 weeks early. It was published on the 16th of January, 1831. So this is, it's a bit extreme, and I'm not saying, if you need to get a plan written, take all your clothes off and give them to your partner and never leave the house again, right? But what it's got is a commitment to a device. And so you could have others. If you find that you go out and you spend money too willingly, or as soon as you leave the house, you have to go and buy yourself a Costa, leave your wallet at home. This is easier when you can't pay for things on your phone, which I appreciate is a bit of a problem nowadays. If you eat too much at night, use a smaller plate. There you go. You can't get as many sausages on a smaller plate, right? If you don't go out and walk enough, buy a dog. Because in having the dog, you've got to go out and it's a device that's going to commit you into keeping these habits, yeah. Automatically save, just don't take the risk. If you don't sleep very well, go and have a look at getting a better mattress as the mattress. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is just to automate these habits within you because they become so easy. And in automating them, they get better and better and better over time. And finally, how do we make these habits satisfying? What can we do to really make them satisfying? So we'll have a look at another example here. So a chap called Stephen Luby, an American epidemiologist, moved to Karachi in Pakistan in the 1990s. And the reason he went to Pakistan was that he knew that there were terrible diseases going through the rough parts of the shanty towns and stuff like that. And he but a lot of them were sort of, they were just born through poor hand hygiene. And back in the 1990s, people hadn't been taught that they had to sing happy birthday to themselves twice whilst washing their hands. And I guess if Stephen had known that, things would be an awful lot easier. Instead, what Stephen knew was you got to do it with soap. And you got to give it a really good rub, because at the time, although the Pakistanis had soap, and actually many of them understood some of the importance of washing their hands in preventing diseases spreading. Oftentimes they would just, it'd be a cursory, sprinkle of water, and that would be all that they did. So instead, what Stephen did was he teamed up with Procter and Gamble, and he teamed up to get P&G to provide a huge amount of soap, which is called safeguard to this population. What was great about safeguard soap was that it smelled nice. It foamed up into a lovely thick lava on your hands, so it's really foamy. And I think it was pink as well. So it's ticking all those sort of century boxes of this is really great, this is lovely. It was remarkable. Within 2 months, the cases of diarrhea had fallen by 52%. Cases of pneumonia had fallen by 48%. Skin disease, psoriasis, stuff like that, fallen by 35%. This was just because people who already knew how to use soap started to use soap properly, because it just seemed so satisfying now to use it. And then once the habit had been built of, I've got to use soap to wash my hands, of course the habit then stuck. And so people continued to wash their hands. It was a brilliant, brilliant way of bringing this story to and reducing these diseases that really didn't need to be there. So again, as I say, what's rewarded is repeated, but what's punished is avoided, and you need this immediate return. So if you're going to reward something immediately, another way, I mean, I'm assuming everyone here thoroughly washes their hands now many times a day. But if it's exercise that you're struggling with building this habit in, perhaps build in the fact that if you go out exercising 3 times a week, you get a massage. Yeah, I mean, something pleasant and enjoyable. Another way of doing this is to build a habit tracker, essentially just a diary that you tick off. Yes, I cleaned my teeth. It's a pretty bad example. Hopefully everyone does that twice a day too. But yes, I went for a run twice a day. Yes, I learned Spanish every day. Whatever the habit is, yes, I wrote in my journal. But by having it on a tracker, you get this immediate sense of, actually it's going really well. You get rewarded by looking at your tracker and tracking your progress. And then, how do you make it unsatisfying? So this is, on the right, is a chap called Ronald Reagan. He's the President of the United States of America back in the 1980s. On the left is a chap called Roger Fisher. He is a World War pilot, hero from the Second World War, and then became a professor at Harvard, and he specialized in conflict management. And his specialty was trying to create strategies to prevent nuclear war, which is, Reagan was there at the end of the Cold War and brought an end to it with Gorbachev. But as I say, Fisher was very concerned about the idea of nuclear war and wanted to create a way of deterring presidents from pressing the red button. And one of the solutions that he described was that the code that you need to input into the briefcase to set off the bomb, right, that could be held in a special glass vial. And that glass vial could then be held, it would be stitched inside of a human subject who would then follow the president around. So if the president then decided it was the right time to press the button, in order to get the code to do so, he would have to slay this person by chopping them open to get the hold of the glass vase so that he could input the code. It sounds like a ridiculous solution, of course it does. But equally, if you're going to set off a big nuclear bomb and kill a few million people, it does make the president think as to whether or not this really is the right solution or not. It's making it a pretty unsatisfactory habit to try and have to kill someone um, to do this. Now, I'm not suggesting that we will go around doing that. Um, but some ways that we can try to do that is one option would be to create a habit contract. So I'm going to go and do something every day, and I'm going to go and tell various people that this is what I'm doing, because I know that if they know and there's a comeback on me not doing it, that's a pretty unsatisfactory ending. So that might be, for example, I'm going to go and tell my wife that I'm going to go jogging 3 times a week. And if I don't go jogging 3 times a week, I have to buy her, whatever she wants, a manicure session or what have you, right? So in creating that contract with people, and then the huge number of examples of this in the book. Another one might be at Weight Watchers, of course, right? So you go to Weight Watchers. I haven't done it, but I think you have to stand there on the scales and say how much you weigh. But it's then going, oh, you've gone up in weight this week. Yeah, it's that bad. It's unsatisfying, the fact that you've gone up in weight, and you have to tell everyone. And finally, there's this chap in Canada. He's a Canadian entrepreneur, I think he's related. Anyway, he has to get up at 5:55 every morning, and he wanted to make this habit stick. And so to make this habit stick, this is the one thing that he did. A tweet is sent from his account unless he stops it before 6 o'clock. And this is the tweet that gets sent out. It's 6:10. I'm not up because I'm lazy. Reply to this for £5 via PayPal. And so there you go. So if you want to get up early and your alarm clock doesn't work, maybe set up a tweet, and then you end up having to pay lots of people $5 to do so. So anyway, I hope that gives you some ideas of how to set and to keep habits in the future.